Well, hi everyone, and welcome to Whistleblower Heroes, everyday heroes and educators sharing the information that you need to know here on Revolution Radio. And I'm your host, Ella. What is a whistleblower? A whistleblower is a person who makes public disclosures of wrongdoing, corruption, and crime. And these courageous people often suffer retaliatory actions because of their disclosures. In the end, many of these people are often the catalysts for needed change and are eventually lauded as heroes. And I'm here to celebrate these heroes and give them a platform, because shining a light on wrongdoing wherever it occurs plays an important role in keeping society peaceful, free, and just. So with me today, I have Kevin Barrett. Kevin, are you there with me?
I sure am, Ella. It's great to be with you.
Great. And you know, I really appreciate journalists because that's one of the many that's the way that many whistleblowers are able to deliver their message. So I think they're an integral part in the participation of whistleblowers and getting the message out. So one of the things I want to just give you a little bit of background about Kevin. So Dr. Kevin Barrett is a Ph.D. and he's an Arabist and there I go, I forgot the word, Islamologist. Did I say that right?
Perfect. As long as you don't say Islam apologist. That's what some people call me, but they're a bunch of idiots.
No, I practiced it earlier, but sometimes it just doesn't come off come across, is one of America's best-known critics of the War on Terror. He is the host of Truth Jihad Radio, a hard-driving weekly radio show funded by listener donations at patreon.com, and False Flag Weekly News, an audio-video show produced by Tony Hall, Alan Reese, and Kevin himself. FFWN is funded through Fundraiser. He also has appeared many times on Fox, CNN, PBS, and other broadcast outlets, and has inspired feature stories and op-eds in the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, the Chicago Tribune, and other leading publications. Dr. Barrett has taught at colleges and universities in San Francisco, Paris, and Wisconsin, where he ran for Congress in 2008, and he currently works as a nonprofit organizer, author, and talk radio show. Host, I should say. So I just want to say, Kevin, thank you again for agreeing to come on and for me to have the opportunity to interview you.
Well, thank you, Ella. It's good to be with you. And you're right, journalists have a really important role. Unfortunately, the mainstream ones have mostly dropped the ball. I got a BA in journalism in 1976 from the University of Wisconsin Journalism School. And then I did a little bit of alternative journalism back then, underground newspaper type stuff, and realized that, trying to be the next Hunter Thompson or Tom Wolfe probably wasn't going to be that easy. And the best writing was in literature. So I ended up getting 4 advanced degrees in literature. And then at the end of that, I suddenly woke up to 9/11 in 2004. And I found myself kicked out of the academy, where you're not allowed to tell the truth about things like 9/11. And I'm now back in the world of alternative journalism.
Which to me, like you kind of surmised that, it is one of the best forms of journalism, although you got to be careful online because there's a lot of, information floating around that may not be accurate. So, don't you agree with that?
Yes, although the question of whose fake news is very real, because the mainstream outlets are fact-checking so poorly these days. Even compared to how they used to be 20, 30 years ago, back when they used to have the bad guys had to kill mainstream journalists every now and then. People like Dorothy Kilgallen, the biggest syndicated columnist in mainstream media, had to be murdered because she was going to tell the truth about the JFK assassination. Today, it doesn't seem like there are a whole lot of mainstream journalists that they would have to worry about killing, maybe every now and then. But the mainstream has largely given up on fact-checking, so they accept utterly ludicrous, preposterous, and easily disproven official stories all the time, without bothering, to even find out what, for instance, with 9/11, were any of these alleged hijackers even on the planes? And it's absolutely certain and clear and obvious that they weren't, yet no mainstream outlet would ever dream of telling you that.
Yeah, agreed. So when 9/11 happened, was that kind of the catalyst and kind of pushed you to kind of become more involved in journalistic endeavors?
Well, yes, in 2 ways. Of course, one was I was in the academy and I was an Islamologist, I had done a dissertation in Moroccan Sufi Islam and storytelling. So at that point, I knew a lot of people from the Islamic community. Arabic was my language, so I was following Middle Eastern media. And the moment 9/11 happened, nobody in the Islamic or Middle Eastern world, any who knew about what's going on, believed it. I mean, basically, the entire population of that part of the world, billions of people, said this is ridiculous. And top leaders said this as well. People in Egypt, a former top advisor to the government there came out the day after saying this is preposterous. I used to infiltrate the Al-Qaeda on behalf of Egyptian intelligence, and so-called Al-Qaeda was basically just a cat's paw for U.S., Israeli, and allied intelligence agencies. They were so infiltrated that it wasn't even really an independent organization. So the idea that it could have pulled this off is ludicrous. And so I was plugged into that world. And so on the one hand, I was getting this insane mainstream stuff, and then seeing, what the other part of the world thought about it. But I spent a couple of years thinking, well, we'll never really know what happened. And I didn't look super closely at the facts of the controlled demolitions of the Trade Center, of whatever may have happened or may not have happened at the Pentagon and the other alleged crash site in Shanksville. So I didn't get into that level of detail for a couple of years. And then once I did, I had some success in organizing to push back against the people who had pulled off this coup d'etat. And that success then led to me being sort of nominated as the whipping boy, the scapegoat for Scholars for 9/11 Truth, which was growing rapidly in 2006. So Fox News and their friends, Karl Rove, Lynn Cheney, and those people came after me with all guns blazing in the summer of 2006. And that made my name and my internet profile toxic in the academy. So even though they tried to get me fired from my teaching job at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, they failed at that because the university did a very thorough investigation and found I was an excellent teacher, nothing remotely problematic about how I was teaching. But unfortunately, since that witch hunt was able to create an internet profile that meant I would never teach in an American or probably a Western university again, I had to find another career. So my, searching for the truth about this and related events naturally led me into the world of putting the results of my research on the internet rather than in scholarly journals. And so that's what I've been doing. And I guess that's called alternative media.
Mm-hmm. So Lynn Cheney, it's interesting that she goes after people. Why is that?
Well, everybody knows that whatever you want to say about Hillary Clinton, mm-hmm. she's smarter than Bill. And the same is true in spades about Lynn Cheney. She's a lot smarter than Dick, which isn't saying that much. And Dick is actually a lot smarter than George W. Bush, which Agreed. Makes you wonder how that guy ended up in the White House. In any case, Lynn Cheney, who has a major role in steering her husband's career, founded a group called ACTA, the American Council of Teachers and Alumni. And it's an AstroTurf group that purports to be a bunch of parents of college students and teachers and college alumni who go to football games and are very angry that there are radical professors telling terrible things to their poor innocent children. So it's an AstroTurf group that tons of money created it, and then they suckered people who watch Fox News and so on into signing up for it. And so they've got this fake group, and that was the group that led the academic witch hunt against me. So I would surmise that Lynn Cheney, of course, I was accusing her husband, Dick Cheney, of as being a major part of the worst crime ever committed in American history, the 9/11 coup d'etat. And so Lynn probably didn't appreciate that. And so that fake group came after me. And I think that Karl Rove probably had a hand in it as well, because I think I was caught up in a sort of a pushback against the truth movement, and especially the academic side of the 9/11 truth movement. And that probably was largely run by Karl Rove, who'd been Bush's fixer, the media fixer forever, and was doing that for the Bush administration at the time, I'm sure with a lot of help. And I think what had happened was that after 9/11, people started waking up to the fact that the official story was complete nonsense. And so
What
it
about
snowballed.
Rumsfeld? Did you feel like he might have been do you think that he might
No.
have been involved in this? No.
Well, as far as coming after me, no, because Rumsfeld had better things to do. But but Karl Rove, his job was political strategy and dealing with media. And see, the problem was that the truth about 9/11 was getting out, and so they didn't know what to do about it. They tried to ignore it and just block it out of the mainstream completely from 2001 until 2006. That didn't work, because it was leaking out through the internet and through these groups that people were forming, such as Scholars for 9/11 Truth. So at that point, the people running the sort of American side of the media cover-up operation, and I think that would be Rove and people around him, had to come up with a new strategy. And that's when they decided to start really smearing the so-called conspiracy theorists. And that's why they suddenly decided to stop ignoring people like me and the thousands of other people like me raising the same questions, and to try to have a witch hunt to make an example of me to scare away the others.
Maybe let's go into 9/11, because, we both agree that it was a controlled demolition. So maybe, what else? What evidence did you see of that? What gave it away to you?
Well, I didn't see it at first. I on the day it happened, I think I saw some, Dan Rather talking about that possibility. But then for 2 years, I just didn't really look into that because it was really too extreme. I knew already about the JFK coup d'etat and things like that. I knew that the U.S. government is very corrupt and that there are some very, very bad people in positions of power. But the thought that they would do something that outrageous didn't seem plausible enough to be worth my time investigating it. So I didn't really look into controlled demolition until December 2003, when I heard David Ray Griffin was onto that. And I respected him tremendously. I cited him in my Ph.D. dissertation. And so when I heard he was taking this seriously, that's when I looked into it and discovered how obvious it was. It wasn't like it's, this is a possibility, it might have been controlled demolition. It's like anybody with eyes can see these buildings are exploding, not falling down from fires.
Yeah, and also, when it hit the building, it was in one area and one floor. And we know that buildings today, it's not possible. I actually saw footage of a plane crashing into another building, and it was just very, it was in one area. I can't think of the better word. It was, it didn't cause really any damage to the framework at all.
Yeah, it was John Skilling, I think, who helped build. Actually, I think he led the team that built the towers, was on record saying that those towers could have easily survived many, many multiple hits from the biggest airliners at full speed, because it would have, they had these redundant kind of webs of the vertical and horizontal steel frame members. So you take out a couple of those, and that makes no difference at all. You take out a lot of them, actually, and it still would stand up. He said it was like sticking a pencil through a screen. If you have a screen window and you stick a pencil through it, you stick another pencil through it, you stick another pencil through it, that screen window is not going to just disintegrate and disappear.
Yeah, that's nice comparison. And then also there was like 4 explosions total when there was 2 planes.
Yeah, there were, 4, you said 4 explosions total?
That's what I heard. 4 total.
Well, there were 3 skyscrapers that were taken down in explosive controlled demolitions. The 2 towers were explosions. You can see the huge 100-ton steel frame members being blasted upwards and outwards from those towers to impale themselves in neighboring buildings. And then Building 7, the 47-story high-rise that came down at 5:20 something that afternoon, was an implosion. It had a little crimp at the top, and it just went straight down like an elevator into the ground with 0 vertical support. All the vertical support was essentially removed at once. Classic controlled demolition. That's how most professional controlled demolitions are. And then, so there were those 3 high rises that everybody focused on. But there's also, there was also probably explosive destruction at other buildings in the complex as well. Building 3 in particular, I believe. And it's interesting that every single building in the Trade Center complex was totaled, and yet nearby buildings at the periphery of the complex that were actually much closer to the towers than some of these WTC buildings not only didn't get totaled, I mean, they're barely damaged. Sure, they got some big chunks of steel stuck in them, but none of them was threatened, much less severely damaged. So that's a conundrum that every single WTC prefix building was utterly destroyed. And in the cases of the three high rises, they were just reduced to little tiny piles of rubble at near free fall accelerations. So there are these obvious explosive demolitions in all of these cases.
Mm-hmm. And you really didn't see anything about Building 3 on the news. So very little coverage did it get, in my opinion.
Yeah, 3 and 6, I think. The other buildings in 5, I forget which, was it 5 that had the cookie cutter hole in it, giant hole. Most of it was just gone, like it had been, scooped out with a giant cookie cutter. These other buildings, which also had eyewitness reports of massive explosions, that's never even really caught the attention of the truth movement as it should. But I guess you don't really need to deal with that when you can just look at 7 and see the obvious controlled demolition and hear the mafiosi landlord of 2 months, Larry Silverstein, confessing on the PBS video America Rebuilds to taking it down. He said we made that decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse. And of course, pull means to conduct an explosive controlled demolition. So once you've got that, you don't really have to worry about these other buildings, and so most people don't. But anybody like the architects and engineers who's doing thorough research into it should pay attention to the other buildings, because there's also proof that bombs destroyed those buildings as well.
Mm-hmm. And there was some really quality documentaries after the fact that kind of woke me up, although instinctively I didn't trust what I was seeing in mainstream news. And I think many people, I think people who are a little more aware might have had that same kind of inkling that this wasn't exactly, the story we were getting wasn't exactly what happened. And then I started to investigate it myself, and I ran across some excellent documentaries. Which one would you recommend to people if they were interested in researching and educating themselves?
Well, there are so many good 9/11 documentaries, and it's been such a long time since I used to be out there handing them out. When each one would come out, I would be showing them in public and handing them out and burning them on my DVD duplicator and stuff. Mm-hmm. And I've gone through a whole bunch of them. One real classic that is no longer officially available is called 9/11 Mysteries. And there's an interesting backstory about how an apparent asset of the cover-up team used devious means to get that video suppressed. So if you get a chance to find 9/11 Mysteries, that's a great one, but you may not find it. But as far as the ones that are more easily available, I would say maybe the first one to watch, if you're a sort of a research-oriented person, would be September 11th, The New Pearl Harbor, which is done by an Italian documentary maker named Massimo Mazzucco. That's a really good, thorough one that actually looks at the debunkers' argument. So it goes over what the people in the truth movement say, what the other side says, and shows you, lets you make up your own mind about who's more credible. And of course, that's, I think, the best way to do it, because that's the way we should evaluate all of these sorts of disputes. And this is a case where it's beyond obvious that it's the heretical side, the side that's suppressed from the mainstream, that is far more credible. So Massimo Mazzucco's September 11, The New Pearl Harbor is a good one to start with.
Yeah, I've heard people refer to that it was compared to Pearl Harbor as well. That sounds
right. And that's kind of that's how this documentary begins, is by noting those parallels. And of course, that's also referring to David Ray Griffin's book called The New Pearl Harbor, which was probably the most important 9/11 book of all time. But the documentary by Mazzucco, September 11, The New Pearl Harbor, goes over pretty much the full gamut of evidence relating to 9/11. So it's not just comparing it to Pearl Harbor. That's just the touch point. It's going over all the evidence about it being an inside job.
Mm-hmm. Now, should we get to the why? Why would they do this? Why would the U.S. government do this, control demolition. The world was shocked when this occurred. So I'm going to give it to you, and you tell us why you think it happened. Or, I mean, to many people it's obvious, but I'd like to hear from your mouth, from your words.
Well, we just mentioned Pearl Harbor, and it's widely accepted that without Pearl Harbor, the United States probably wouldn't have been able to enter World War II. And we, of course, have this myth of World War II that says it was the good war. And so it's a really good thing that we went to war. Well, if you believe that it's a really good thing that we went to war in World War II, then you pretty much have to also accept that it's a really good thing that Pearl Harbor happened and 2,000 American sailors were murdered and blown up on their ships in this bay in Hawaii. But of course, that event has been carefully studied, and it's another of these cases where the so-called conspiracy theorists are obviously right, and the U.S. government or elements of the U.S. government and the British government not only were aware that that attack was coming and purposely chose not to warn the sailors and let them be murdered, but also actually created that event by way of an 8-point plan. People can Google this, the 8-point plan that was designed to make sure that Japan struck the first blow, which would allow the United States to enter the war. At that time, 80% of the American people or more didn't want to enter World War II. The only way to get them to enter the war was through a shocking event, making it look like America had been attacked. And so that, and of course, that's the same for all wars. From the Mexican War of 1846-47, when there was a fake Mexican attack that never happened, that launched the United States war against Mexico to steal half of its territory, to the Spanish-American War in 1898, when the Maine was blown up from within and blamed on the Spanish to steal all of Spain's colonial possessions in the Spanish-American War, to World War I, where the Lusitania was sent into a fleet of U-boats full to the brim with armaments, and the Germans had announced that we won't allow you to send any more armaments to Britain. So they send the ship full of armaments and passengers straight into a fleet of U-boats with predictable consequences. So the ship sinks, and it's a huge, shocking event like Pearl Harbor or 9/11 that drags the U.S. into World War I, or paves the way to it anyway. And then we had the Gulf of Tonkin incident that got us into Vietnam in a big way in 1964. A fake attack never happened, but the newspapers all told Americans that the evil North Vietnamese had attacked us. So this happens over and over and over. Whenever a powerful country wants to go to war with a less powerful country, and of course that's the only kind of country that ever wants to go to war, is the powerful country, because it thinks it can win, it has to convince its citizens that they're being attacked, that they're not the aggressors, because human nature doesn't like to be the aggressor. So in virtually every case that somebody wants to start a war, they gin up a public relations stunt, a fake enemy attack, or an orchestrated enemy attack like Pearl Harbor, to make sure that the public will be behind the war effort. So that's what 9/11 was. It was one of a long series of these false flag war trigger events. And right now, we might very well be seeing another one developing any moment, because the Trump administration, which is completely controlled by Netanyahu's faction of Israeli extremists, those people want a war on Iran. And yet Iran hasn't attacked another country for centuries. So they've already tried on at least a couple of occasions to create a fake Iranian attack on an American ship. And in fact, Gwyneth Todd, who was the advisor to the head of the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, exposed a plan to murder American sailors by sinking an American ship and blaming it on Iran, or rather Bahraini Iranians. So Gwyneth Todd, when she blew the whistle on this to the State Department, she was nearly assassinated. And she's been in hiding in Australia, surviving assassination attempts from, was it maybe the FBI or who knows what American agency. And that was, she prevented that attack on the American ships in 2007. So now we're all set for another attempt for the hardline Israelis who seized power in America with their 9/11 coup d'etat to try to launch Netanyahu's long-desired war on Iran. And the way they would do that would be staging some kind of attack that looks like it's been perpetrated by Iran or one of its allies. And I would say I wouldn't be surprised if such a thing could happen anytime now.
Yeah, so basically it was to destabilize the Middle East. And I heard that the plan was was specifically to get 7 countries in 7 years involved in war.
Yeah, actually, that's a quote from General Wesley Clark, who said that he learned from a top neocon shortly after 9/11. Well, first he learned that we were going into Iraq, and he said, "Why Iraq? What does that have to do with anything?" And then a little later he hears, "Oh, it's actually worse than that. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years." Now, those 7 countries were precisely the 7 countries that were causing a problem for Israel, starting with Iraq, where Saddam Hussein was funding the families of suicide bombers who had been very successful in creating an exodus from Israel among the Jewish population of Israel. At that point, the tourism industry had been destroyed. People were fleeing Israel. Nobody was emigrating to Israel, and the Israeli economy was in tatters at that time. So, Iraq was just one of these 7 countries that was, in one way or another, supporting the Palestinian cause and making this project of maintaining the state of Israel, which nobody in the region believes is a legitimate state. Everybody essentially agrees that it's a euphemism for the genocide of Palestine. The legitimate state is called Palestine, and that the invaders and occupiers who came in and mass murdered much of the population and forced the rest to flee and are keeping millions penned up in concentration camps like the Gaza Strip, that this is completely illegitimate. Nobody in the region accepts this, except a couple of bought and paid for people like the current Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. So the Israelis have a really tough time keeping their little experiment in genocidal colonialism going. And they have literally billions of people around them who say, no, you can't do this. So in order to keep it going, they've had to resort to extremely radical measures. And 9/11 was one of them. This destruction of the 7 countries that caused trouble for Israel is another. And Iran is the biggest problem of all those 7 countries. And they've been trying to drag the U.S. into a war on Iran ever since 9/11. And they're really getting close to that now. They've got Trump, who's an asset of the Kosher Nostra, the sort of ethnically Jewish organized crime outfit that is the main criminal organization in the U.S. and the world. Trump was created by Ray Cohn, who was one of the godfathers of that organization. And he's been an asset of that organization ever since. His hotel business and his gambling business is just a front for money laundering for the Kosher Nostra. Always has been. It's no accident that Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, is a Kosher Nostra princeling whose father went to federal prison for organized crime activities. So we're right on the edge of a war with Iran that would be vastly worse than anything we saw with Iraq. And so that's once again a reason to remember 9/11 and to be prepared when they wheel out the next, Hezbollah just fired a huge bomb and killed a bunch of people, or the Iranians just sank a ship, or whatever they're going to tell us to justify this war for Israel against Iran, so they can continue to mass murder people in the Middle East and around the world for Israel. And we need to understand that this is really what it's about, that the United States is under the thumb of Israel, and the people who run interference for Israel in the United States, many of them are not extremists like Netanyahu. And many of them are sort of liberal, nice, humane American Jews who've been miseducated about history and believe that they have to kind of cover up for Israel when they write for liberal newspapers and things like that. But American journalism is totally dominated by people with loyalty to Israel. The financial sector is top-heavy with people with that set of loyalties. About half of all the money that flows into federal campaigns comes from pro-Israel people with strings attached. And there's this so-called Zionist power configuration of maybe 500,000 plus people that is really hardcore activist in supporting Israel. And they're funded by hundreds of millionaires, dozens of billionaires. This is all described in James Petrus's book, The Power of Israel in the United States, which is better than the one by Walton Mersheimer that has gotten more publicity in the mainstream. Bottom line, Israel has largely owned the United States since 1967. Some would say since 1963, when they helped kill Kennedy and put their controlled asset Johnson in power in order to get the 1967 war and to get their nuclear program. And they've certainly owned the United States lock, stock, and barrel since they ran that 9/11 operation.
Mm-hmm. Can we go into a little history about Israel and the Zionist agenda? A little more information, just for, if the audience and the listeners aren't aware in detail what's going on and what their agenda is?
Sure. There are a lot of really good books on this. So let me just recommend those first, because people shouldn't just believe what I say. They should go and do some research. And some good places to look are Alison Weir's book, Against Our Better Judgment. Her last name is Weir. That's about how Zionist power in the United States created Israel through devious means. And there's a new book by a Dr. Laurent Guyénot, Guyénot, a French guy who wrote the book in French. I translated it into English and published it in English. It's called From Yahweh to Zion. Yahweh is spelled Yahweh. So From Yahweh to Zion. And these two books provide much needed historical background. Guyénot's book goes into the whole thing back from the beginning of what now is called Judaism, and looking at how elites within the Jewish community have manipulated their own people and others for their own power and profit going back 3,000 years. And Alison Weir's book, Against Our Better Judgment, is about how this has been going on in the United States during the past century as Israel was created. Now, the short version of the creation of Israel is that the official story is that a bunch of basically secular people from Jewish ethnic backgrounds reacted to prejudice against Jews in 19th century Europe by starting the Zionist movement to create a country where Jews could be sort of normal citizens of their own country. And Theodor Herzl is seen as the founder of Zionism. He was working at the end of the 19th century. And then the other narrative is that, which I think has a lot going for it, is that actually there's a millenarian project here that is this idea of creating a perfect world through revolutionary means. Kind of, it goes back to a guy named Shabtai Zvi in the 1600s, who declared himself the Messiah and said all the Jews had to go back to the Holy Land. And that didn't end too well for him, but it did launch this project. And so ever since then, there's been this belief among a certain element of both the Jewish and Christian communities that if the Jews can return to the Holy Land, they can force God to bring on the Messiah. And this is what many Israeli Jews believe today. This is what many American Christian Zionists believe today. So it's kind of a combination between the sort of secular nationalist project founded by Theodor Herzl and a fanatical, religious, and I would say satanic, heretical project founded by Shabtai Zvi, and today represented by many Israeli Jews and American Christian fundamentalists. This is what led the movement to invade the Holy Land, mass murder the people who were living there, and chase most of the rest of them out, and then set up this so-called Jewish state where Jews have far more privileges than whites had in apartheid South Africa, with Jews-only roads, Jews-only checkpoints where all the non-Jews have to wait for 3 hours while they're dying instead of going to the hospital. Jews-only housing. The good housing is all Jews-only. Most of the land in Israel is Jews-only. If you're not Jewish, you can't live in all of this most desirable land. All sorts of government programs to help you get jobs, education, housing, all Jews only, Jews only, Jews only. So it's the most radical racist apartheid state that's ever existed in human history. Some would say Nazi Germany was worse. I don't know. I'd say it's maybe a toss-up. So that's where we are. It's a very, very fanatical country. Virtually all, like 90% of the Jews living in Israel who are enjoying this apartheid privileged racial status support the mass murder of Palestinians in these incursions in Gaza, where they mass murder Palestinians by wiping out women and children with white phosphorus. They are perfectly happy that Israeli soldiers shoot Palestinian children for sport. This is a regular practice of IDF soldiers. They lure children within range of their guns by barking out insults, obscene insults about the kids' moms over megaphones. And then when the kids come out to throw stones, they shoot them for sport. Chris Hedges wrote about watching this happen. And British Medical Journal documented 600-700 such cases in an article published a little over a decade ago. So this is really a horrendous country. It's everything that we've been told about Nazi Germany, maybe worse. And it's being completely propped up by the American taxpayer. It wouldn't exist for another 10 minutes if it hadn't been constantly propped up for the last, well, ever since the genocide in 1948.
Mm-hmm. Why do you say satanic, and what leads you to believe that?
Well, Shabtai Zvi, the founder of Zionism, declared himself the Messiah, but he was a weird Messiah. See, in normal Orthodox Judaism, the Messiah is somebody who comes and puts things right, and he becomes the king of the Jews and takes his place on the throne in Jerusalem. Now, putting things right could mean, on the one hand, making the lion lie down with the lamb and everything on earth becomes beautiful and good. And it could also mean he conquers the world for the Jewish tribe and establishes Jewish supremacy over all the other tribes. And that's actually a little bit more the way it sounds in Jewish tradition, going back through much of Jewish tradition. In any case, so all Jews are waiting for the Messiah, who's going to do sort of one of these two things, or maybe some combination thereof. Now, Shabtai Zvi had a different take on this. He said, okay, we're not going to wait until God makes this happen. We're going to force God's hand by going to the Holy Land, engaging in systematic abominations like human sacrifice and sexual orgies. And this is going to so gross out God that God will send us the Messiah. That's basically the Shabtai Zvi philosophy. And now it's been taken up by his followers. Many of them don't know that they're his followers, who have been part of this project to invade the Holy Land and commit abominations like sport shooting Palestinian children, dropping white phosphorus on people, driving people out of their homes, and so on and so forth. So by satanic, I mean that this is a project whose whole purpose is to revolt against God and revolt against reality, revolt against the world as it's given, by saying we are going to, do these horrific things that are basically going to overthrow God, and in his place will be the Messiah. Now, I would argue that this project is going to give us not a Messiah, but an Antichrist. And clearly, the Zionist Christians in the United States and many Zionist Jews in Israel, their end game is to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the greatest and oldest Islamic monument in the Holy Land, and in its place build a blood sacrifice temple. So, and that they believe that this will cause the Messiah to come back. Now, the Christians say it'll bring Jesus back, who will then, preside over a nuclear war. And the Jewish Zionists, whatever you want to call them, millenarians, say that no, this will be the Jewish Messiah setting up on his throne in Jerusalem, and he will rule the world and put the Jewish tribe on top of all the other tribes. So to me, this is all a satanic project, because what is Satan? Satan is the force that is misleading humans in all ways, getting them to do bad things or trying to, and then also he's the symbol of revolt against God and the reality that God has created. So that's what this project really is. It's a project of revolt against all goodness, against morality and decency, a program of systematically committing abominations in order to create a new dispensation that would be ruled over by an antichrist or a false messiah.
Well, that really explains a lot, and it was very educational to me as well. And I've talked to people about the Zionist agenda and Satanism. That was very, very, I really like that, how you explain that. And I guess I just am curious, with all this information that you have, do you have any hope? Do you feel like we're going to get a handle on this?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that reality is basically a little deeper than most, our modern materialistic worldview suggests. So I think we human beings are here not just to go through life in physical bodies, and compete with each other for status and possessions, and try to achieve our desires and ultimately just die and go back to nothingness and rot in the ground. I think that we are spiritual beings having a material experience, and this material experience is a test to see how much we can do the right thing. And if you do more good than bad, you will be rewarded. This is a kind of a simplistic way of explaining it, but that's the base level kind of description of it. So we're all being challenged to do good, and this is actually all of this bad stuff is a real challenge for people to step up and do good and really take the extra step, go the extra mile, be extra courageous and stuff. So all this bad stuff has that good side of contributing to this test that we have, this possibility we have for doing good and speaking truth to power, standing up courageously for justice, and fighting for justice, fighting against oppression, fighting against oppressors, and fighting on behalf of the oppressed. Gives us all sorts of wonderful opportunities to do that. And the best thing that could possibly happen to us is to be martyred in the cause of goodness. So nothing they can do to us can harm us. I mean, the worse they try, the better it is for us. So that's the basic setup, according to which it's all good. But in terms of, how does this actually play out in the world? Will this really ugly, this particular satanic movement I've just described, which is far from the, it's not all human evil is linked to Zionism. There's human evil every time, somebody envies another person and does something sneaky and underhanded out of that envy. It's this evil every time somebody is cruel, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all kinds of evil in the world, and it's all part of this test for us to avoid it. And as far as radically changing this situation, I don't know. I'm agnostic on that. Is it possible that somehow some change will come about that will change the conditions of the tests that we undergo in this world, so the tests will be a little less onerous? I don't know. I don't even know if that would necessarily be a good thing. I mean, in some ways it would be, but I certainly have hope that the people who are standing up for truth and justice and goodness will be rewarded. And I think they can be sometimes rewarded in this world as well as the next world.
Mm-hmm. Well, it kind of leads me into a conversation that I've been having with many people is, and this is kind of off topic a little bit, but what is your opinion on torture and human experimentation that seems to be going on in our own country? Hello? Did we lose him?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I just had a quick brief hiccup on my computer. Yeah.
It happens.
Torture and human experimentation is obviously one of the forms of, really extreme forms of evil that we witness. I'm sure there's always been torture, or at least in the human experience going way, way back. It's been something that crops up. But as far as the modern forms and human experimentation in the name of science, this is a particularly perverted twist on that age-old horror, and it's tied in with the dominance of this materialistic scientific worldview, according to which there's no goodness in the world, there's no morality that's built into the fabric of the universe, so we're all free to do whatever we want. We can be good or we can be evil, and it doesn't really matter which. So according to that worldview, there's really no reason not to be a scientist who takes children and tortures them for knowledge, because, well, there's, we all instinctively, all of us have God-given morality, or most of us, except for the psychopaths, have enough God-given morality to be repulsed by that prospect. But intellectually, there's no reason not to, if you believe in the materialist worldview. And so we're living in a world where this materialist worldview has been promulgated to every end of the planet. And so naturally, that's provided excuses for the psychopaths and for people who can be induced to be acting psychopaths, even if they weren't when they started, to do things like cruel experimentation. I would add, cruel experimentation on animals is also evil. And
I agree with you there. It's disgusting. It's repulsive to me.
It's a slippery slope too. Mm-hmm. Once they start doing it to monkeys, and those monkeys are conscious beings and they're suffering, and so then, well, why not do it to people? And Nazi doctors are infamous for this, but it's been done by a lot of the leading countries, including the United States. And if people don't know about this, they can Google Operation Artichoke, which is a precursor to Operation MK Ultra. That the reason that Frank Olson, the CIA doctor or scientist who was thrown out of a window to his death back in the early 60s, was the reason they had to murder him, was that he'd been involved in these artichoke experiments in which they tortured people to death, in mind control experiments. They tortured about 100 or more people to death, mostly in Europe, experimenting on prisoners primarily. and Frank Olson was disgusted by it, and he was going to blow the whistle, so they dosed him with LSD and threw him out of a window and came up with a bunch of excuses for what supposedly happened to him. But the truth has been fully established now, in part thanks to the efforts of his descendants. So yeah, these kinds of horrific experiments are one of the many downsides of this materialistic world that we live in, where materialism and scientism are the dominant ideologies. And we need to, one of the things we need to do to try to make things better is to try to reduce the power of these false ideologies and to remind people of the reality that we are spiritual beings having a material experience.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was Project Paperclip that originally came up with so many of the ideas behind experimentation in these World War II Nazis and scientists. They were creative. They definitely came up with some of the most horrifying experiments known to man, to me at least.
That's right. And I get attacked a lot by people on the Jewish Zionist side of things who claim that I'm anti-Jewish for talking about the downside of what Israel is doing and the downside of Jewish tribal identity politics going back 3,000 years. But I also get attacked by apologists for the Nazis. Because, of course, the Nazis are in our culture, the Nazis are cast as the ultimate evil and Hitler is the devil. The iconography of evil, instead of the devil's horns and his forked tail and his pitchfork, today is the Hitler mustache. You paint that on somebody the way you used to put horns on somebody. And so it's natural that when people start waking up to reality, which is a lot more complicated than these public myths that we're inculcated into, they start doubting some of these tall tales that were fed, these myths about our enemies are 100% evil and we're 100% good. But some of these people, then they go too far and they say, oh, well, the Nazis must be 100% good, and their enemies must be 100% evil. And I think that's just as stupid as the other way around. And I have no use for the Nazi movement, which it was responsible for these kinds of tortures and experimentation. It was pro-eugenics. It was extremely racist. It was genocidal, although Mein Kampf by Hitler tells you that they're going to exterminate the Slavs. He says bad things about Jews, but the people that he's going to exterminate and steal their land are the Slavs, looking for Lebensraum. So the Nazi movement was nasty. And it's funny, though, that I get attacked by Nazis occasionally, and every time I say something unpleasant about them, there's always somebody complaining. So just for the record, let me tell your listeners that the Nazi movement did a couple of good things, along with lots of really bad things. And among the good things it did was institute a degree of public currency, which helped the German nation recover economically in the 1930s from utter and complete disaster to becoming an economic powerhouse by the late 30s. And the way they did that was through public banking and by getting out of the Rothschild banking cartel. And that was a good move. So there's one good thing that the Nazis did amongst a lot of really bad things.
Yeah, I just don't think, in that case in particular, and even the Zionist agenda, it's not black and white. And we both know there are good people no matter where they're from and whether they're Jewish or whatever the case may be, Protestant. So would you agree with that as well?
Yeah, that's right. There are pro-Zionist people who are basically good people. And they've, in other areas of life, they would be wonderful. But in this one area, they just feel connected to, and they feel just instinctively supportive of this project that they've been taught is a good thing. And it's not. It's like Nazis. Likewise, a lot of the stormtrooping Nazis back in the day were probably convinced that this was really a good thing. And they were good people, and they took the food home to their families and led normal family lives and stuff, in the same way that the Zionists do today. And people can be wrong without being evil. I do think, though, that there are psychological blocks that keep people going along with evil. In the case of Zionism, I think that a kind of there's an Old Testament fanaticism that reads the Old Testament and says, "Yeah, go for it, Joshua, exterminate all those people in Palestine." You can misread the Old Testament, or maybe just read it and get some pretty bad lessons. So I think a lot of the Christian Zionists have, as well as Jewish Zionists, have that problem. And then I think also that especially the Jewish Zionists have been brainwashed into believing everybody hates us, even though we're totally innocent. And so, because we're basically good people and totally innocent, and throughout all of history we've been persecuted and they all want to kill us, we have to take extraordinary measures to try to protect ourselves. And those extraordinary measures then include committing all sorts of evil.
Agreed. So we just have a little bit of time left, and let's get to your online publication or your media outlet. You're an editor, probably the editor for Veterans Today Online.
I'm not the editor, actually. The senior editor is Gordon Duff.
Correct. That's right. I saw that last night.
Yeah, he's a former Alphabet Agency guy who was not too happy about 9/11 and CIA drug smuggling and other things like that. So he's one of our great whistleblower heroes. You should have him on sometime. But no, I'm just an editor. And I also I've been publishing at heresycentral.com, and that's a really great new site put up by Jonathan Ravusky that I think is really providing the conversation we need, questioning the most pernicious public myths that govern our society today. So that's heresycentral.com. And my website is truthjihad.com.
Great. And then what about the veterans aspect to Veterans Today?
Well, I think what that's really about is that Gordon and some of his Vietnam veteran buddies post 9/11 said, this has gone too far. This is like, we knew when we went over to Vietnam that was an evil war. And now, we're getting into another one that's even more evil. And these bastards just blew up the Trade Center and murdered 3,000 people and blamed it on their enemies to drag us into this war. And so let's take advantage of the internet and push back. So that's really what VT is all about.
I wonder what the percentage is in America that don't necessarily believe that the events that happened in 9/11 were accurate, the story that we were told.
Well, depending on how you phrase the question in the polls, you could probably get anything from 15% being truthers to 85 to 90. You can look at like in one of them, I believe it was only 16% of the people fully believe the government is telling the truth about 9/11, and so 84% will not say that they believe the government is totally telling the truth, and the other choices included partially telling the truth, partially lying, or mostly lying, totally lying, whatever. So in that poll, 84% of the American people doubt the official story. And then there's another poll that showed 36% of the American people think it's either likely or very likely that 9/11 was an inside job designed to trigger wars in the Middle East. So that's more than 100 million Americans. And then there have been other polls that could, where they phrase it differently, that can push those numbers down to maybe 15%. Are you a truther? Well, no, probably only 15% would say yes.
What about some other areas or topics that are considered truth movements that interest you?
Well, there's such a long list of them.
There is. We have anything from chemtrails to, as we're speaking about 9/11. So.
Yeah, I think a couple of real important ones that get you the issue of psi, that's PSI, psychic abilities, which are very real and have been proven by science, but not fully accepted by the establishment, even though the scientific evidence is completely undeniable. That's an interesting issue, and that's tied in with the issue of spirituality and which is the right worldview, materialism, or let's say consciousnessism, where we believe that reality is basically the product of consciousness, as quantum physics tells us it is. So those are interesting issues. Then there's the ET issue. Are there extraterrestrials, or there must either be real extraterrestrials, or there must be very powerful people who